Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We'll be exploring spirit possession today. With me is Dr. Terence Palmer, who is the author of The Science of Spirit Possession. He's a member of the British Society for Psychical Research, as well as the Scientific and Medical Network, and he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's a privilege and an honor to be here, and I really do appreciate being invited.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank
you, Terry. When we think about spirit possession, as you and I were discussing earlier, maybe the most fundamental way of looking at it is that each of us is in possession of our bodies. We are possessing ourselves.
Absolutely. This is a question that I'm often asked, and my immediate answer to the question is that we have to acknowledge the simple fact, really, that we are a possessing spirit. We are a spirit entity that possesses a physical form, and that's the fundamental groundwork that we have to work from.
The implications of that, of course, are quite enormous. Most people think of themselves as identical with their body, and you're suggesting something different.
That's right. When we acknowledge the truth that we are a spirit occupying a physical form, then we are able to identify our self, our true self, as the spirit and not the body that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. Not the body that we present to the world. Mm-hmm. That is not the true self. That's just a...
And I think we should acknowledge right at the outset that this is a viewpoint that stands in contradiction to Western materialistic science,
yes,
for the most part.
Yes, you're right. Material Western science has difficulty recognizing the spiritual nature of our true self. Mm-hmm. Probably because of the physical dimension that encapsulates the thinking. Mm-hmm. We think inside a physical box, and it's very difficult to get outside that way of thinking. Mm-hmm.
Now, we will have an opportunity in a separate interview to talk about the evidence, and our viewers on this program have heard a lot of evidence for the operation of the human spirit or psyche outside of the physical body. But for now, let's just take that as the background of what we're going to talk about, because we're really looking at the implications of that evidence when it comes to possession. Mm-hmm. And it's a term that has been used throughout human history in almost every culture as a way to identify both physical and mental illness.
Yes. Spirit possession is generally regarded by social consensus as being negative. Mm-hmm. And there is a correlation, there's a relationship between mental illness and negative spirit possession. But it's important, I think, to emphasize that not all spirit possession is negative. I mean, if we begin from the premise that we are a spirit that occupies a human form, that's positive to begin with. And we can be influenced and possessed by positive spirit, by good spirit.
In fact, many religions involve the incorporation of higher spiritual energies in mediumship.
Absolutely. And people experience this in their daily lives. But because it's frowned upon, so to speak, and not accepted by social consensus and science, people don't really talk about it very much.
Well, you had the experience of what we would call channeling a book that was transmitted to you, a book of philosophy that came from some sort of a higher source identifying itself as Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher.
Yes, and this was at a time when I had absolutely no knowledge of these things whatsoever. I was completely naive. I'd come from a business background, and I had no religious beliefs or affiliations. And I suddenly began to experience an irresistible compulsion to write. I'd been asking fundamental questions about the meaning of life, as we all do from time to time.
Well, you were experiencing something of a personal crisis around
that's right.
then.
That's right. In 1990, the British economy suffered a huge collapse. It was at the end of Thatcherism. There was a huge rise in material confidence and finances during the Thatcher years. 1990, it just suddenly collapsed. And I was working in the Sudan at the time. I'd been conditioned by United Nations and Save the Children. This was the peak of my career as a transport consultant. And when I came back to UK, I came back to a business that didn't exist anymore. So I was asking fundamental questions. How does this happen? You know, what have I done that was so wrong? And I needed answers to these fundamental questions. And then I began to write. And as I was writing each chapter, I'd write it and then I'd read it. And I think, where's this coming from? This is really, really interesting. And in order to help me take a new direction in life, I decided that I was going to get educated and go to university. I needed to understand how the mind worked, so I took a course and studied hypnosis. And it was when I was working with a young man who'd come to me for help with hypnotherapy. At the same time that I had this compulsion to write. And I had no idea where these ideas were coming from. They just emerged. But one day this young man was sat in front of me, and we've been doing some hypnotherapy, and he came out of a trance and he said to me, he said, I just had a very, very strange experience. I felt that someone wanted to speak with you, but it wasn't me. So I said, this is interesting. Shall we find out what's going on here? So he willingly went back into trance, and I'm going to condense a long story into shorter version now, but the upshot of it was that a spirit possessed him, took possession of his body and his ability to communicate.
His vocal cords.
And his body came upright. He was still in trance, but the body came upright, the head came upright, and the eyes open. And he looked at me, and I could see that it wasn't him. They say that the eyes are the windows to the soul, and this was the first time I'd actually witnessed the truth in that. He looked at me, and I could see it was not him. So I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "My name is Lao Tzu." And I had absolutely no idea who he was. I'd never heard the name before. I knew nothing about him. Of course, I did learn who he was. Eventually, after we'd had several conversations over many days, weeks, sometimes long into the night, and this character who named himself Lao Tzu was giving me instruction.
And now these conversations were with the student?
With the student.
Under hypnosis?
Under hypnosis, every time. And he'd become used to this.
But I gather he indicated to you he was the same entity, spiritual entity, who had been the source of the writing you were doing.
Absolutely, because he knew what I was writing. How did he know what I was writing? If it hadn't been him that had inspired it in the first place. So, I mean, this was wonderful. I was gaining this knowledge and understanding slowly, trying to accommodate these principles. I had no idea that these were the principles of yin-yang, Taoist philosophy, and I knew nothing of these things until one day at college, we were distributed a handout by the lecturer, and there was a quotation, a poetic verse with the acknowledgement of Lao Tzu. And I thought, that rings a bell. You know, I've heard that name before.
Yeah.
I've been having conversations with this guy for weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So I said to the lecturer, excuse me, you've got a quotation here from Lao Tzu. Can you tell me who that is? Well, she didn't know.
Oh.
But another student in the class said, oh yes, I've got a book of his at home. I'll bring it in tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So the next day, he presented me with a copy of the Tao Te Ching.
Mm-hmm.
And I read the back cover, and it said on the back cover that this was the second most widely translated spiritual philosophy, second only to the Bible worldwide.
Mm.
Well, you can only imagine my astonishment and my disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
So I went home and I telephoned the young man and invited him, because by this time we'd become close friends. He used to come round to my house for dinner. I said, come round for dinner, and I've got a question for you. So he said, okay. And I showed him the book.
Mm-hmm.
And his reaction was the same as mine. Well,
mm-hmm.
really?
Mm-hmm.
So I said, come on, I've got to talk to this guy. So he sat down, went into the trance, and when he emerged, the eyes opened, and he looked at me with a wicked little smile on his face. And I said, why didn't you tell me who you are? And there was a twinkle in his eye as he said, because isn't it so much more fun to find things out for yourself?
Mm.
And that was the beginning of my education about spirit possession and the spirit world.
In a very positive context.
In a very, very positive way. Now, I wrote that book. It took me 3 months to bash it out, so to speak. But then it took me 20 years to have the confidence to actually get it published.
Mm.
Because I needed the evidence to show people that I wasn't crazy.
Yeah.
That this was a genuine experience. And I had to accommodate that. I had to process that and come to understand it. And for me, that's been a long journey.
Well, I think it's fair to say that historically, in virtually every culture, when we talk about spiritual entities, the ethno-historical traditions suggest that there are positive ones and negative
ones. Yes, yeah. And I'm predicting a second question coming now, Jeffrey. Do I have experience of a negative one?
Well, I happen to know that you do.
Okay. Would you like me to describe it for you?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm in the process of learning from the experience of Lao Tzu that there is a spiritual realm. And I wanted to become educated further. In addition to studying psychology, the science, and I was developing my skills as a hypnotherapist, I also attended the spiritualist church to find out from them about the spirit world. And I was invited to join what's known as a development circle.
For mediumship.
For mediumship, yeah, because I couldn't see spirit or hear spirit. My only experience was either having an idea put into my head that I then used my own faculties to interpret. And the other experience was having a spirit actually speak to me as a person, as I'm speaking to you now.
Right.
It's exactly the same thing. So I needed to be able to perhaps develop my skills in other ways of communicating. So I joined a development circle. And in that circle were 7 people. It seems to be a significant number for development circles. They always seem to comprise of 7 people for some reason. And in that circle was a married couple. The woman was in a wheelchair. She had multiple sclerosis, so she used to go to church for healing. Her husband had recently discovered the gift of automatic writing. And that is another form of spirit possession. It's where the spirit takes possession of the hand and actually uses it to write a message.
Yes.
Whilst the owner of the hand is completely dissociated. And there are varying degrees. They can be completely in a trance, unaware of what's going on, or they can be aware of what's going on. But this was my first experience. It was just shortly after the experience with Lao Tzu. So there was the circle, gathered together to develop their mediumistic skills. And they were part of a Christian spiritualist church, so they said the Lord's Prayer, and they asked for protection. And they went into their meditative state that enabled them to communicate with spirit.
Yes.
And I'm sitting in the circle, and I'm watching this. I'm watching people going into their meditative state. And suddenly, everyone in the circle began to show signs of disgust, as if they could smell something dreadful and have a really bad taste in the mouth, and they wanted to get away from something. They were showing all the actions of...
You had your eyes open and you were looking at everybody.
See, I was the only one that wasn't in trance. So I was observing this.
Yes.
And the young man, with the pad on his lap and the pen in his hand, and he was virtually falling off the chair in trance. He was completely unaware of what was going on. But his hand started to write. It drew a circle, a perfect circle, and I defy anyone to draw a perfect circle without the aid of a compass. Perfect circle. So I got up and I stood behind him, looked over his shoulder, as everyone else was showing signs of disgust and wanted to get out of there. And he wrote in the circle, "Ha ha ha, Terry doesn't know. Terry is helpless. Terry is powerless. Ha ha ha."
Referring to you, of course.
Yeah, of course. And what it was writing, I say what it was writing because it wasn't the man who was writing.
Yes.
It was the spirit that possessed him that was writing. Was absolutely right. I didn't know. I didn't know anything. And I was powerless. And there were these other people suffering some kind of evil interaction, and I was powerless to intervene. Eventually they came through the experience and they were showing as if they'd been tasting something foul and stench.
Yes.
I couldn't taste or smell anything. I just witnessed their reactions.
Yes.
And it was distressing for them from the experience, and it was distressing for me to witness it. And they were really frightened.
This was not their normal experience.
Not at all. Not at all. And that development circle never met again. It was destroyed and never came back. So I needed answers. I needed to understand how this happened and what happened and why I didn't experience anything. I was just the witness. So when I went back to the spiritualist church and I asked a medium, I said, "How is this allowed to happen?" And I got a very, very straightforward, succinct answer. "For your learning." And that was it.
Yeah.
I got the message. There was something here I needed to learn, needed to understand, and needed to learn how to deal with. So I've had my positive experience with Lao Tzu.
Yeah.
Now I've had my negative experience. And what became apparent to me was that our guides who protect us when we ask for help, when the time is right, they will actually step aside and allow you to learn from an experience, even if it's a negative one. Now, isn't that interesting?
Well, Terry, my interest in parapsychology began after I earned a master's degree in criminology at University of California back in the 1970s. I made a decision to switch from studying negative forms of human deviance to positive, but it's well known in the field of criminology that there are certain people who commit horrible acts and believe that they are being told by voices in their head, "You must commit this murder," and they do.
Yes. So, and they do. So my experience of positive and negative spirit possession set me off on a path of education, right, which has led me to where we are now, having earned a PhD in the subject and written the book. But in addition to my academic and scientific pathway of study, I became a practitioner in what's known as spirit release therapy, and we'll be talking about that.
We will
I understand,
do a whole interview on that.
Yeah. So it opened up a huge world for me to explore.
Now, here's an issue I think we need to focus in on, and it has to do with the nature of a spiritual entity itself. You have indicated that it's very hard to distinguish between an autonomous spiritual entity, for example, the spirit of a deceased individual, as opposed to a thought form that a person may generate on their own, because a thought form can take on certain autonomous qualities.
Yes, it can. And the best example that springs to mind of this was documented by the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, who I'm sure you are familiar with.
Certainly one of the pioneers in the whole field of hypnosis.
Yes, and he was presented with the case that became known as the case of Achille. Achille was a simple man who lived in Marseille with his family, and for some reason, he went on a business trip to Paris. And when he came back, he was showing signs, the classic signs of demonic possession. And he was admitted to the psychiatric hospital in Paris, where Pierre Janet was principal psychiatrist. And his case was debated between the psychiatrists and the exorcists, because he displayed all the characteristic signs of exorcism. So when the exorcist said to Pierre Janet, this man's not possessed, he needs your help. So poor Pierre Janet thought, well, how am I going to deal with this? So he used hypnosis to trick the devil.
It's because at this point the Catholic Church had been able to make a distinction between demonic possession and mental illness.
Well,
this exorcist,
that's debatable, really, because there it's very, very difficult to tell.
But the exorcist, in effect, said that to Pierre Janet.
Yes, and Pierre Janet was then left holding the baby, so to speak. But he discovered a way of dealing with it, and he used hypnosis, and he communicated with the possessing demon of the man, and discovered that when the man had gone to Paris, he'd been a very, very naughty boy, and he'd been unfaithful to his wife. He'd met a lady of the street, and when he went back, he felt guilty about it, so he had to be punished. So he created a self-created demon to punish him, and that was his possession.
And that's probably not so uncommon.
It's not uncommon, and there are many, many cases of people who have a self-created thought form that is there to punish them for some breaking a taboo or misdemeanor.
In other words, we have the power to create thought forms, or fixed ideas is another term I think used in psychiatry.
Yes.
And then become possessed by the very ideas that we create.
Well, there's a distinction there, you see, between the fixed idea, which can be an obsession, and a fixed idea can induce us into all manner of behavior, obsessive compulsive behavior, for example.
Right.
But the self-created thought form can actually do us physical harm.
Yeah.
It's like an entity that's created that will physically beat us up and cause bruises and so on.
My mother was an actress.
Right.
And she, on one occasion, she played her greatest role was playing Blanche Dubois in Streetcar Named Desire, a very famous tragic character in an American drama by Tennessee Williams. And I watched her literally become possessed by this fictional character.
Well, that's brilliant acting, isn't it?
But it also lasted outside when she wasn't on stage.
So perhaps she actually became became possessed by the character that she was playing.
Yeah,
It's an
at least,
interesting-
you know, it came and went, but I think it never left her for the rest of her life.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we talk about possession, what we really have to think of from this conversation is that there's a wide spectrum of phenomena.
It's huge, and it's part of the difficulty in working in this field is to discern what kind of discarnate entity we're dealing with. Is it the spirit of an earthbound person? Is it a soul fragment from a past life? Is it a self-created thought form? And the list goes on, really, and it's a huge area of exploration.
Well, I know we've just scratched the surface on
That's all
on this topic, and I'm glad that we are going to have some additional interviews to pursue these areas in more depth. Terry Palmer, our time is up. Thank you so much for being with me.
And thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.